So the last thing that I want to talk about from this chapter is where neuroscience is today. Neuroscience as a separate field actually is a pretty modern phenomenon. So really until like 50 or 60 years ago, people who studied the brain wouldn't necessarily have called themselves neuroscientists. They might call themselves physiologists or pharmacologists or what have you. But really, again, in the 20th century, you see scientists that really think of themselves as specialists in the nervous system, and so that's where the term neuroscience really starts to appear. And nowadays, there are people who study the nervous system at lots of different levels. So at the very basic level, you can study the molecular makeup of the brain and the nervous system. This is called molecular neuroscience. And what that means is you're studying really the molecules that are special to the brain and to neurons, what makes them special and why they're so important. So if you're a molecular neuroscientist, you might be interested in neurotransmitters or receptors or ion channels. A cellular neuroscientist, meanwhile, is interested in the cells that make up the brain and spinal cord and the rest of the nervous system, especially the neurons and the glial cells, which we'll talk about later. What makes them different from other types of cells, how do they behave, and what properties are important for brain and nervous system function. Systems neuroscience then is at the next level. So you're looking now at how networks of neurons work together to give you a particular function or particular aspect of behavior. So for example, if we talk about the visual system, we're talking about those parts of the brain and the rest of the nervous system that are directly involved in vision. So that includes the eye, because that's the sensory receptor for the visual system, the neurons in the retina that detect light, and then the nerves and the parts of the brain that process that information. So there are lots of different systems that we'll talk about in the nervous system as we go along. In behavioral neuroscience, you're studying behavior, obviously, but really you're looking at how do the different brain systems and networks work together to allow for complex behavior. So you're looking at both sensory systems and motor systems and how they interact. You might be interested in memory and information processing also. And then at the sort of highest level or the most complex level you're looking at is called cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience is the study of really what we think of as high-level mental phenomena. And in fact, that really includes things that are kind of human-specific. So we're talking about language, we're talking about attention, things like if you want to go all the way up to the nature of consciousness. Now, that doesn't, when I say these are human-specific, I don't mean that humans are the only animals capable of these things, but it's things that are only really possible to study in humans. It requires asking complex questions and expecting a subject to engage in a complex series of behaviors to test. So it's things that are difficult to study in animals if they exist at all. And then, again, if you are studying the nervous system, you might have a different title depending on what kind of specialty you're in. There are lots of different fields within neuroscience. It's a big kind of umbrella for a lot of different specialties. And what you call yourself kind of depends, one, on your training, and then two, what you specialize in. So you can either, if you want to study the brain, become a clinical neuroscientist or an experimental neuroscientist. A clinical neuroscientist is someone who has a medical background. So that means someone that goes to medical school, gets an MD, and then chooses to focus on some part of the nervous system as their specialty. So, for example, a neurologist is a medical doctor that you would go to see if you have a particular mental or cognitive issue that you think may be caused by a specific issue. And so, for example, a stroke or other kind of brain damage, you might have a neurologist study you to figure out which part of the brain's affected and how. Then a neurologist might send you to a neurosurgeon, which is what it sounds like. It's a surgeon who specializes in the brain and the rest of the nervous system. So, a neurologist might diagnose, for example, a brain tumor, and then a neurosurgeon would be the person you would go see to perhaps have the tumor removed. And then a neuropathologist is someone who, again, a medical specialist who focuses on the tissue in the nervous system. Typically, a neuropathologist studies brain samples of brain tissue or nervous system tissue that are either taken from a patient, so that's called a biopsy, or they might study your brain, your nervous system after you're dead. So someone who studies the tissue or the organs of someone who's dead or suffering from disease would be a pathologist. And then kind of the other end of those specialties, you have a psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist is, again, a medical specialty, but then a psychiatrist is someone who focuses more on the higher level aspects of the brain, deals with things like mental illness, emotional disturbances, and that sort of thing. But again, those are all medical specialties, requires a medical degree. Some clinical neuroscientists might only see patients, might only do treatment. Others might do a combination of treatment and research. And some MDs that focus on the nervous system might do research full-time instead of seeing patients. And then an experimental neuroscientist is someone who usually has a PhD. Again, you can go into experimental neuroscience with an MD, but not the other way around. So if you have a PhD, you cannot usually deal with patients to treat disease. But a PhD is a program where you focus on research and you focus on how to do research, and you have a particular research question that you focus on when you get your PhD, and that then prepares you to be an experimentalist. So I, for example, have my PhD in neuroscience, but that's, again, a purely experimental or purely research degree. It's not a clinical specialty at all. And again, what you then study as an experimental neuroscientist is kind of what you go by. So again, a molecular neurobiologist is someone who studies the special molecules like receptors and neurotransmitters of the nervous system. Neuroanatomist would be somebody who's interested in the brain and the nervous system as organs and how the different parts interact. Neurochemists and neuropharmacologists are interested in the chemistry of the molecules of the nervous system. Pharmacology in general means studying how molecules from outside the body, namely drugs, interact with the body. So a neuropharmacologist is particularly interested in drugs or medications that might affect the brain and the nervous system. Neurophysiology is about mostly the electrical and properties of the nervous system, and not only that, but how maybe nerves and synapses interact with other parts of the body, like the muscles or the heart. Biological psychology, or in many cases just psychology, that's those two are become more and more interchangeable, but someone who studies the brain or the mind, and again looks for higher level studies higher level phenomena like language and attention and so on. Psychophysics is not as interesting as it sounds. It's basically mostly studying the physical properties of the sensory systems and how those systems work. Developmental neurobiology is the study of how the brain develops during as an organism grows from an embryo to a full-fledged adult. And then a computational neuroscientist is someone who studies the nervous system not by actually looking at the brain or at neurons, but by producing computer programs that model or mimic some aspect of the nervous system behavior, and then using those models to perhaps predict the behavior of a more complicated system. And of course, you may find individuals that do fit more than one of these categories. So someone who's a developmental neurobiologist, but really focuses on a particular neurotrophin, for example, might also be considered a molecular neurobiologist at the same time. So again, that's kind of where neuroscience is today. So if you go to college and then graduate school and become a neuroscientist, you might, again, get a PhD in neuroscience, but you might also get a PhD in biochemistry or cell biology or something like that, or psychology, and then choose to do research with that. Or again, you might go to medical school and then focus on neurology or neurosurgery, and then if you wanted to, you could also do research. Mainly, if you want to do research on people, you pretty much have to either be an MD or collaborate with someone who has an MD. And so that's the main difference. There are, in fact, what we call MD PhD programs where you can get both at the same time, but generally most people only get one or the other. Okay, so I will stop this chapter there, and next time we will talk about neurons themselves.